So once again, we're going to do some interpretations questions this week, and there are 3 that you will need to send to me for marking and feedback later. And the 3 questions are 3B, 3C and 3D from your GCSE Russia and the Soviet Union exam. And these are the ones that deal particularly with the interpretations. So just to remind you again, you've practiced question 1, which is inference, question 2, which is explain why. Question 3A is always going to give you 2 sources and ask how useful they are for something. In the case of this today, we're going to be doing the B, C and D questions, and the topic is collectivisation, and you can see on the screen in front of you some details of that. Particularly this work is going to focus on the successes and failures of collectivisation. So as always, it's probably best if you revise this and think about it before you even start looking at the sources and interpretations, because of course this is what you're going to do in the exam. You're going to revise before, presumably, hopefully, you're going to revise thoroughly before you go in. So please have a think, have a look back, have a revise, use this sheet in front of you, screen in front of you, if necessary, before we get started. So we are going to start by looking at the 3B question, which is always going to ask you about the main difference between 2 interpretations. In this case, looking at the effects of collectivisation. So once again, we're looking at the effects of collectivisation. And it's quite a straightforward task, this one. It's only 4 marks, 5 minutes. It needs to be clear, simple, straightforward. And all you're doing is you're looking at interpretation 1 and identifying what that is saying about the effects of collectivisation and giving a couple of precise quotes from the interpretation to back that up. So if you look at interpretation 1 and read it through, it's clearly pointing out that the effects of collectivisation weren't great, they were poor. And again, perhaps there's 1 or 2 little bits that you might quote from it to help support that suggestion. So you might pick out the bit about peasants being transported to Siberia, quote that, or about the serious famine with the death of millions of peasants. You then would move on to saying, on the other hand, or alternatively, and you turn to interpretation 2, which, if you read through, has a bit of a different interpretation, because the suggestion here is that the effects of collectivisation were positive. And again, you could quote a couple of bits from interpretation 2 about the introduction of mechanisation or the countryside being transformed to support that assertion. So nice and straightforward, nice and easy to do these questions. Keep it short, keep it simple, and move on to the next one. And for question 3C, what we're looking at is why these interpretations are different. And this is where you state that the interpretations are different because historians give weight to different sources. They prioritise different sources. And there should be a mix and match you can do here. So you could say, well, interpretation 1, which gives the viewpoint that collectivisation didn't go particularly well, you can match that with, presumably the historian here has used source C, because source C talks about the negative effects. And you need to quote a couple of things to support that from the source. So again, the source, if you look, source C talks about the famine, talks about villagers being exiled and being marched off under escort and soldiers being used to force them to do things. On the other hand, alternatively, the historian in interpretation 2, which talks about the positive effects of collectivisation, presumably they prioritise and use sources such as source B. Again, if you look at source B, there are some things in it that are reflected in interpretation 2. So it's got lots of things about tractors being used, more a mechanisation, and presumably things being modernised and the countryside being transformed from a previously backward peasantry. So all you're doing here is you are once again trying to find which interpretation, which source the interpretations have used, and be clear, be short, be simple, 4 marks, 5 minutes. This really is a mix and matching exercise. Interpretation should match with the source because Historians come to different interpretations on the past, often because they give weight to different sources. They simply use different sources to come to their interpretations. Now for 3D, this is the big one, of course, 20 marks, 30 minutes at least on this, and this is the question where you're going to have to put across an opinion, a judgment, you're going to have to use the interpretations, and you're going to have to really impress the examiner with this question. It's worth a lot of marks. So you need to plan this. You need to spend some time before you start thinking about what your judgment is. It's always helpful if you come to the exam having your own opinions on the past and your own thoughts and your own judgments, rather than just being expected to, come to conclusions in the exam itself. So in this one, you're looking at how far you agree with interpretation 2 on the effects of collectivisation. Now, there is a 4-paragraph structure here that we practiced on industrialisation and before. So you're doing the same structure as that. And your opening is your judgment. How far do you agree with interpretation 2? Interpretation 2 is clearly reflecting on the positives of collectivisation. Do you agree with that? How far do you agree with that? So your introduction is a bit of a preview of your overall argument and your overall conclusion. It need only be short, but at the same time you're looking for 3 or 4 sentences of development of your argument, almost previewing it to the examiner. Your second paragraph is where you deal with interpretation 2, and here perhaps you pick out some of the information in interpretation 2 that helps you to show that the effects of collectivisation were positive. So there's some in there about tractor provision and new methods being used and the countryside being transformed. Have you got any evidence in your own knowledge, any other benefits that you can bring to help support interpretation 2 that collectivisation was a good thing? And this is where you need precise information from your own knowledge as well. So you build a nice second paragraph using quotes from interpretation 2 about the positives, but also using precise examples from your own knowledge about the positives as well. Now that brings you on to the third paragraph, where you're looking at interpretation 1. You must use both interpretations in these questions, these 3D questions. So interpretation 1 is painting a different picture to interpretation 2. It's talking about the negative effects. So you would take focused, precise quotes from interpretation 1 to support the viewpoint that the effects of collectivisation weren't good. But then you're moving on also, and are there things from your own knowledge, precise examples or information that you can use to show that collectivisation was negative on the Soviet Union from this period? So again, you're building up a nice big paragraph that takes information from interpretation 1 here, but also adds precise, impressive own knowledge that you can use to help support that. Now that brings you on to paragraph 4, which is a nice developed conclusion, not a short one of a couple of sentences where you just state your viewpoint, but actually something really quite developed and impressive where you put forward your overall argument about how far you agree with interpretation 2, but you also deal with how far you agree with it too. You wouldn't just sort of completely agree with interpretation 2 or completely write it off. You would agree to it perhaps to a limited extent or to a strong extent, and then present reasoning for that opinion, evidence to back up your judgment. So make your fourth and final paragraph, your concluding paragraph, something that is really going to sign off this exam with the examiner, something that really gets across that you're an able student, a thoughtful student, who's able to come to their own judgments and opinions, but back those up with impressive evidence from the interpretations or from your own knowledge too. So like I say, spend some time on this, be impressive, be confident, plan it before you start, spend at least 30 minutes on it, be careful with your spellings, 4 paragraphs here, and what you need to do this week is send me your 3 answers to those 3 questions for marking and feedback. Good luck.